I'm the CEO of Sandus. Sandus is the South Australian Network of Drug and Alcohol Services. I've been there about a year and a half, and we represent the 30 or more non-government organisations who deliver drug and alcohol treatment services in South Australia. The main point of Sandus is to provide independent advice and advocacy for its members, and on matters of social and health policy and significant issues affecting our members, we foster working alliances with similar purpose organisations at local, state and national levels. Workforce development and capacity building form a key part of our work, and that's why I'm kind of here today. As Carl said, I'd previously worked at the Centre for Excellence in Child and Family Welfare in Victoria, the Centre for Child Protection here in South Australia, and then I went on to NCETA. And all of my work has been about trying to get those disparate groups of services who work with our community members who have challenges, whether it's drug and alcohol or family violence or child protection issues or whatever, to work more effectively in that space. So we've recently done a fairly big piece of work around the intersection between alcohol and other drugs and gambling. And it's a really interesting space because one of the things that we find is that, as Nick mentioned, people are more embarrassed and more ashamed of their gambling than they are of their substance misuse addictions. And so that's probably one of the challenges. What I wanted to talk today about was, though, the intersection between gambling, technology, and I've used the term technology because I think it goes beyond gaming. I think it goes beyond what kids are doing when they're playing Crossy Roads and stuff like that. It goes to the whole of our interaction with technology. So I think that's a bit broader, and it becomes hard if we start to think about what kids are doing as gaming as separate to the rest of the stuff that they're doing on the internet. Because some of the best maths games, anybody got kids who play mathletics? Mathletics is a kind of junior primary thing which teaches kids to do their maths. It's actually built with gambling devices in it. The way that you get rewarded for getting a sum right, and you build up and you earn gold stars or you earn points, etc. There's a bit of gamification going on in a lot of our educational stuff. Gamification of programs, etc., actually makes them interesting and exciting. And that's fairly challenging. What I wanted to do, though, was talk about some of the limitations of this kind of work. And as everybody said, we're in the very early days of this kind of process. And we know very little about what happens when we interact with computers, let alone when we interact with gaming technologies on computers. And that's an enormous problem because we're actually working in something of an evidence void when we're talking about this. We know how poker machines work, and we're fairly clear how they work, and we know what the problems with poker machines are. We know what the challenges of drug and alcohol are because we've done a lot of research in drug and alcohol and stuff like that. But in 1990, when I first it would have been later than that, in 1992, I got a job in the Northern Territory at a university, and it was the first time I had seen an interneted computer. And because I was in the university sector, we were part of ARNet, it was called in those days. And the internet existed as a network between universities, and people in the general public couldn't access it. You could have a computer at home, but you couldn't be internet connected at home. And that's 1997. There was a young guy, long-term unemployed. That's who I worked with, the long-term unemployed. There was a guy in my first group of long-term unemployed kids. He had a telephone number in Sweden which was a free call telephone number in Sweden in 1997, and he could go onto a computer in the computer lab at uni and he could dial up this number online and he could get into the internet as an individual person. He was a hacker. I didn't realise it for years, but he was a hacker. And he would go online and he played, well, there weren't really massive online games in those days. There were about 50 people maybe that he would play with. And they would play Dungeons and Dragons and versions of Dungeons and Dragons and stuff like that online. Now, and I have to say, in that year, I think it was that year, or it was the year John Howard was elected, there were something like 1,000 web pages in Australia. You could access 1,000 web pages off a computer in Australia. There are now billions of the bloody things, and they're growing exponentially, and the number of games, the number of software toys, if you want to call apps software toys, is huge. So we want to look at what are the commonalities between gambling, drug and alcohol, and internet gaming. And we also want to look at what are the possible harms. Is there a harm between these intersections, and how does that relate to not just children, but children and families? So what's happening with children and families? And then maybe have a discussion about what to do about it. So one of the things to understand about this is that we're talking about another level of comorbidity. And we're now starting to stop using the term comorbidity. No, that's fine. That's fine. All right. We're trying to stop talking about comorbidity and start talking about complexity, because there's more than one other morbidity with every morbidity. So people who have drug and alcohol problems very frequently have mental health problems, they have family violence problems, they have gambling problems, they may have employment problems, etc. So if we take a look at this first circle, that's your population. Let's say that's the population of Australia, and it's about 100%, because that's what you call a whole population. Of that, about 80% of us drink. Now the colours are going to change up there and it's not going to be as good as it looks here, but I'm sorry about that. So about 80% of us drink. Of those people, about 40% roughly drink more than they should. That is that they drink between 2 and 4, they drink more than between 2 and 4 standard drinks on any single occasion, or they drink more than about 14 standard drinks in a week. So that's not hard to do. Quite frankly, the level at which risky drinking is set is quite low, so quite a lot of us fall into the risky drinking category quite a lot of the time, unless you're a Salvation Army person, because you don't drink. We also have people with mental health problems, and some people with mental health problems are also risky drinkers or problematic drinkers. And some people with mental health problems don't drink at all. So we've got to recognise that you can have a mental health problem and you can have a drinking problem, or you can have both. And the both of them sit in that little Venn kind of hoop there in the middle. And then we think about the number of people who are in mental health treatment, because 1 in 5 of us will have a mental health problem at some point in their life, but very few of us will get treated for it. Most of us self-correct. Most of us go through a period of depression, or we go through a period of anxiety, or we go through a period of emotional dysregulation, etc., and we self-correct. Interestingly enough, when we look at people who get into AOD treatment, which is about, and I can tell you that oval shape for AOD treatment there is much bigger than it really is. There were about 10,000 treatment episodes for AOD last year in South Australia, and that represents about 1%. But if I'd made it 1%, it would have been a dot in that intersection, and it wouldn't have been very visually appealing. But of those people who drink and have mental health problems, a number of them will go for treatment. And so comorbidity occurs where you've got people who've got a significantly problematic drug and alcohol issue combined with a significantly problematic mental health issue, that they will seek treatment for one or both of those. It's very hard to do this diagram. You wouldn't believe it, but it's taken me years of thinking to think about how to make this diagram work. And one day I'll do it with all the correct statistics so that in some kind of thing that doesn't, it'll be gamified, put it that way. There are other complexities here, and that is the poverty line. And it was just a fluke that I managed to think this up at the time. But you can run a line through there, and there's a big chunk of people below the poverty line. So poverty is another morbidity. I haven't overlaid this with gambling. Gambling problems that lead to treatment, correct me if I'm wrong, Rosemary, but would be less than 2% of the population. Would that be right? That's an estimation. And it depends, yeah. So there would be another little dot in there, which is gambling people. And there are people who have a gambling problem, who have a drinking problem, who have a mental health problem, and there are people who have a gambling problem as a standalone gambling problem. Okay, so that's comorbidity. What we're seeing, we think, and I will be really clear, this is not a researched talk in the sense that Ben would do a research talk or somebody else would do a research talk. This is a thought piece. What we think is happening with kids who get involved in gaming and online gambling is that they're kind of entering this space, one of these little circles, possibly quite young. And that's why we're concerned about it. So Manningham YMCA Youth Services and the University of Adelaide, I think it was Paul Del Fabro and King, etc., have a great website, Manningham's website, around youth gambling. They've got a great youth youth problematic internet use, they call it, site. And it looks at the habits of 13 to 17-year-olds. And of the research that they did, 25% have gambled in a video game. 6% had played gambling games on a mobile. So now that most kids have mobiles that allow them onto the internet. 9% played on Facebook. 4%, quite a low percentage, had gambled on casino sites. 2% had gambled with real money, usually their parents' money. But 40% had an intention to gamble with money, possibly when they got money, possibly when they got their parents' credit cards, etc. What's really interesting is that 94% play video games. There's very, very, very few kids now who are not in this video game space. And 3 to 15% of them met a criteria that was established in this piece of research as addicted to video games. Now, I'm going to challenge the word addicted. I don't like the word addicted. It's stigmatising. When you read the advertiser, they talk about heroin addicts, they talk about ice addicts, etc. I don't like the term addiction. It's a medical term. It's fine in the DSM-5, etc. But most people that we know are probably not addicted, but they are probably dependent. And if we start to use more inclusive, less stigmatised language, particularly around things like drug and alcohol and gambling, we can get more people to talk to us about it. We can reduce that level of stigma. And one of the ways of thinking about that too is to stop thinking about this as a moral failure in our young people. And it drives me berserk when I read and see the stuff on, the 7:30 report and Sunrise about, which is couched in the terms of moral failure or individual choice or you're stupid because you gamble, how dumb can you be, kind of messages that get sent out by the media. When on the flip side, you can talk to people like Rosemary and people like Ben and people like Kate, and there are huge multinational industries wedded to making us make those choices, you know. We're not making those choices in a vacuum. We're actually being encouraged, coddled, tricked into making those choices. Really interesting thing. I quite like doing questionnaires. I'm a bit of a sucker for questionnaires. So I got sent a questionnaire the other day on the telephone, and it said, rate your experience. And I can't remember where I'd been. I was a hotel or something, a what if thing. So I rated my experience. And it said, you've rated your experience. Now we can make you all of these great offers. So then you have to go through pages and pages and pages. No, I don't want life insurance. No, I don't want stuff. No, I don't want that. No, I don't want somebody to ring me up about going to the Bahamas. No, I don't want... Well, and I would have gone through 52 at least no's to get out of this bloody webpage. Last week I got my phone bill. There was $30 on my phone bill from an organisation that does online gaming. And apparently when I click through these screens, I mustn't have said no to one of them. They tell me I didn't say no to it, I said yes to it. And that has allowed them to deduct from my telephone bill, from my Telstra bill, $9.95 a week. $9.95 a week. And I didn't know about it until the third week of that deduction, when I opened my telephone bill and went, wow, my telephone bill this month is $340. Why is that? It's usually way under 300. That's because there's $30 in this thing. And when I checked my messages on the phone before I stood up and started talking, I have been sent another casino gaming with $10 of free credit. And I know that it's a spin-off from this thing. So we have a society that is accepting of the fact that this push selling, I don't call it selling, I didn't choose to buy that service. It is push selling or theft. Yes, thank you, Rosemary. Theft. And Telstra are actually coercive or codependent with that company because they're getting the cash flow and they will be getting a cut. And they have given a third-party authorisation to take money. Now, our kids are on our phones all the time. Or if you've got a kid like mine, they're on the phone all the time because he doesn't have his own phone. And that means we're open to this kind of stuff all of the time. Now, this is going to be really quite difficult to read from back there, but it's basically a taxonomy of problematic internet use. And so up at the top you've got predisposing factors, and these are the kinds of things that you might expect to see in a young person with, or any person, an adult, because it's an adult problem as well, that might lead to them engaging in problematic internet usage. So low self-esteem, they're being cyberbullied, they have particular personality traits, they're reward-seeking kids, and they might be risk-taking kids, boys. Why is it more boys than girls? More risk-taking behaviours. Socialisation, nature or nurture, I don't know. Boys tend to take more risks. I think it's socialisation. Maybe family discord or mental health difficulties. They may be mental health issues in the family. Are there parents who are actually present with the child as opposed to giving the child something to do while they go off and deal with other issues? High engagement with technologies. I was telling Rosemary about a boy that I know who's got 2 computer screens facing his bed and a TV with a Wii attached to it facing his double bed, and the whole bed is surrounded by technology. Then there's another computer that backs onto that for doing homework, and that's in a really tiny bedroom. There may be genetic temperamental vulnerabilities. There may be lack of parent authority or parent over-control, parent over-pressure, so the child's doing it. And the child may also have an untreated mental illness. They may have anxiety, they may have childhood depression, etc. Down the bottom, are protective factors, things that will protect kids from significant internet usage problems. So proactive parenting styles, and I think that's one of the things that we really have to start to nut out. What are some of the parenting strategies? And that's what we need to talk to parents about and engage in dialogue about and think about, and go back to what did we do about smoking in kids? How did we convince kids to not smoke? And we did. The smoking figures for adolescents now are about 50% of what they were 20 years ago. Really interesting. They're still too high. They're still significantly higher than they should be. But if you go back and look at historical data from 20 or 30 years ago, adolescent smoking was huge. Really dropped off. Encompassing real world situations. Getting the kids out and actually doing something else. And because everybody else stole my thunder, I'm going to make a diversion here. Does anybody know about the rat park theory of addiction? Yeah, a couple of people, yeah. So when we talk about addiction and the way that we think of addiction, the early studies on addiction were done in America, surprise, surprise, and in the UK. And what they did was they got rats, little lab rats, and the rats were all genetically identical so that you couldn't do the nature-nurture argument. And they put the rats in a cage, and in the cage they put two bottles. And in one bottle they put opiated water or morphine, and the other was a bottle of water. And they sat and they watched the rats, not where the rats could see them, but because that would stimulate the rats and might change their decision. And the rats in those cages would go and they would drink the opiated water once they had discovered it. Interestingly, they didn't like it at first. They wouldn't drink it at first because it's extremely bitter. It's a very unpleasant taste. So the rats wouldn't drink the opiated water. But then once they worked out what the effect was on them, they started drinking it. And what they discovered was if you left a rat in a cage by itself for long enough with a bottle of opiated water, it would overdose. And it would just go and go and go and go, effectively until it killed itself, if it could. And everybody went, well, that's really interesting. Opiates are a really addictive substance. And if we give them to people, they're going to get really, really addicted. This wasn't held in the natural world, though. If you looked at people who were opioid addicts in the real world, most of them were not people who had been prescribed opioids by their doctors. Millions of people were being prescribed opioids by their doctors at that time, and they weren't addicts. There was another really interesting thing happened. A whole lot of people went off to Vietnam and they fought in Vietnam. And whilst they were in Vietnam, they used heroin in very high quantities. Some estimations say that 50% of all troops in Vietnam were injecting heroin during tours of duty. When they came back from Vietnam, the retention in addictive behaviours was about 5%. So there was a Canadian guy, I like Canadians, there was a Canadian guy, and he went, we've got a flaw in our theory about addiction, and it must be fundamental. And so he took a bunch of about 20 rats and he built a cage about, big cage, half the size of the stage or something, and he put rat wheels in it, and he put lots of food in it, and he put climbing things in it, and he put boy rats and girl rats in it. And if you put boy rats and girl rats in a cage together, basically they fornicate a lot. And then he put water and opiated water in the cage. And what he found really interesting was that the rats would come up and they would try the opiated water, and some of them would use it 2 or 3 or 4 times. But basically after a week, none of the rats were using the water. So, if you want to get somebody addicted to something, you deprive them of the things that give them joy in their life. And they will go into addictive behaviours. Emotional stress, anxiety, fear, relationship breakdown, all of those things that kind of suck the joy out of our lives make us far more likely to shift. Why do organisations like AA have such a good record? Because they recreate communities for people who have been isolated by their substance abuse or their dependence. And they bring them back into a community and they give them a joy in their life. They give them a community and a connection. And that's what's really important. So real world activities, I'm not just talking about football and stuff like that, because they can play that online now. But I'm talking about actually getting them out and being involved. Strong commitment to schooling requirements, expectation. And I'm a bit of it's going to be another diversion. There's a guy called Vroom, V-R-O-O-M. I think it's the best name that you could ever have. I think he was Dutch. And he came up with expectancy theory. People do what they're expected to do. So you're all sitting in your chairs, listening quietly because you're in a room where you're expected to sit in your chairs and sit quietly. If it was the French Revolution, you'd be throwing vegetables at me because that's what was expected. But Vroom said if you take people and you create an expectation, they will either live up or live down to that expectation. You can't do it anymore, but they did a really interesting experiment in a school where they took 4 grades in a school, A, B, C, D. A's were the academically brightest, D's were the dumbest. I was in 8D, 9D and 10D when I was at school, so I can say that. And at the change of a year, they swapped the report cards. So they faked the report cards and they gave the A students the D students' report cards and they gave the D students the A students' report cards. And then they tracked them for a year. And at the end of that year, nearly all of the D students had gone up significantly in their academic grades. Nearly all of the A students had gone down significantly in their academic grades. And I can't quote the figures to you, etc. But that's the power of our expectation around what we do with young people and the way that we motivate young people. And Carl said it at lunchtime when we were having a side chat. The power of teachers to influence and drive change in children is therefore phenomenal because it's teachers that set the expectation around a lot of the schoolwork. So in lots of things, we can't just work with families and we can't just work with community services. We also have to work with teachers and education about what do we do about this PID stuff. Strong self-reflection, and that's the emotional intelligence stuff people were talking about, getting kids to talking with kids about this stuff, making them aware. And then external factors. So where kids do have problems, making sure that they get help, which might be counselling or psychotherapy, but also that strength of engagement with the thing, with the schools and the teachers. Now, Kate actually touched on all of these things, so I'm not actually going to go through them, except to say that when you gamble on a poker machine, one of the reasons that a lot of people say that they gamble on a poker machine is that they get to a point where they're in a zone, and that zoning out or being in the zone is flow. It's where everything is kind of focused. You're really relaxed, bang, 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 and you're completely unaware necessarily of what you're doing. And that flow process is both a really positive and a really negative thing. You can have flow in your work. You know, those days where you go to work and you get into work and instead of checking your emails and stuff, you just start writing a paper or doing something, and by midday you've nearly finished and you've thought, wow, that wasn't hard at all. It's midday already. That's a flow state. Other days you go in, you check your email, what's happened on the ABC, who's done what on Facebook, and you check your bank account and your phone bill and all of that kind of stuff, and it comes to midday and you've done nothing. That's a non-flow day for me. So flow is really important to this process of gaming. She talked about Pharaoh, and it's a Spanish word for pride or reward. I'm not going to go back. And that fun or frustration, that fun failure kind of thing. Really interesting, the fun failure and the pride things are things that we see in people as they start to go into dependent use of drugs. Okay? So the social respect that they get from their peers, the recognition that they get, the relaxation that they get, are all of the things. People don't start using drugs to be harmed by drugs. They use drugs because drugs meet these same kinds of things. And drugs of abuse are basically targeting your dopamine pathways, and people have talked about that. But those dopamine pathways are also really important for why do you like food? You know, when you eat marshmallows, it triggers a dopamine response. When you eat chocolate, it does. When you drink alcohol, it does. When you pat a dog, it releases dopamine. So they're really important natural rewards, food, music, sex, all of those things are driven by your dopamine response. And a drug of abuse basically increases your dopamine release, okay? So if you take food that you really like, piece of chocolate, etc. Chocolate's a bit risky because chocolate's probably verging on a drug. When chocolate was first introduced into Europe, out of South America, it was treated the way we now treat heroin. There were catastrophic articles in the newspaper saying that chocolate was going to ruin society and that there would be people lying around in gutters just totally dependent on chocolate and stuff like that. The 1700s newspapers about chocolate are very, very funny. So when you take something like that, it increases your dopamine. When you take something like cocaine, the first time you take cocaine, that's what it does, but it gives you about double or triple the amount of dopamine that you would get from a foodstuff. So you go back and you think, oh, will I have chocolate or cocaine? Well, if I've got cocaine, if I've got access to cocaine, I'll have cocaine. Accessibility is a really strong determinant of whether or not you're going to use a drug. So you'll use the cocaine because you get triple the hit. However, the more cocaine you use, or the more methamphetamine you use, or the more alcohol you use, the more tolerant your body becomes. And dependence or addiction is a point at which your body has become so used to the drug that it needs so much of the drug that it will actually do significant harm to your other physical systems, let alone the fact that once you've flooded your dopamine system, the process of your body reabsorbing dopamine actually gives you that feeling of down or depression, etc. So you can't have an up without a down. And that's a really important message to get out to kids. If you're doing something that gives you a really, really huge up, whether it's playing a game on the computer or using a substance or eating 1.5 kilos of chocolate, you're going to have a down. You know, there's a swing and there's a roundabout, and I think that's really important. Gameplay involves repeated actions that strengthen brain connections and underlying memory and learning. So one of the things that happens in gameplay, which I think is really important, so your brain's like a telephone network. It's got thousands and thousands and thousands of wires in it. Think about your brain as a telephone network in a city. There are some people that get lots and lots of phone calls, people that are cute, people that are attractive, people that are rich, people that are politicians. Their phones go all the time. There are other people who live isolated lives who don't know many people, maybe the very elderly, and their phone might only ring once a week. After a while, Telstra's going to come along and go, it's not worth having that telephone in that old person's house. let's cut it off. And that's basically what happens in our brain. We prune what we don't use, and we strengthen what we do use. When you look at a child or an adult playing a computer game, there's somebody who is reinforcing again and again and again a brain pattern. Once you've reinforced that brain pattern, your brain actually wants to go along that track. It actually wants to use that neural connection more than it does one that's not actually there. I'm not going to go through all of those things, but Carl will send this out, or somebody will send this out. But one study claimed frequent players can get video game brain. This means that key parts of their frontal lobe become underused, and that can affect their mood, etc. So by doing something repeatedly, we're actually creating a condition where we change the way in which we are able then to process other things. But it's important to say, when you look at the neurobiology of gaming, that they have both positive and negative effects on the human brain. They can be used to educate through repetition and feedback, as well as those more negative side effects. So one of the challenges that I have with my 12-year-old is he hates learning his 12 times tables. But if I could get a video game that embedded the 12 times tables into the video game, and he started playing that, he would know his 12 times tables in under 5 minutes, because he would enjoy playing it. And I think we need to be aware of that kind of issue. And I also think that we need to be aware of the fact that notions like this, as I said, we're really 5 or 10 or maybe 15 years into this kind of enormous monolithic business that is computer games growing up. And it's complex and it's very novel. We're starting to hear a lot of the use of the term internet addiction, etc. There's a lot of public media and research interest. But a bit like chocolate in the 1700s or cocoa. Cocoa, they tried to ban cocoa because men were leaving work early to go to cocoa shops in London. You think, why weren't they going to pubs, but they were going to cocoa shops? Because the cocoa was more addictive than the alcohol, because it was new. There's a lot of commentary and debate on this stuff, but at times there's a lot of heat and light, but not really a lot of knowledge generated about it. And so one of the things I'd actually say is we actually need to be thinking really critically about the knowledge that we're generating about this kind of stuff and thinking about it. But it is true to say that most of the people who have gambling problems, not most of the people, I shouldn't say that, a lot of people who have gambling problems have a co-occurring drug and alcohol problem. And a lot of people who have a drug and alcohol problem have a co-occurring gambling problem. And a lot of people who use one drug go on to use another drug. The government at the minute has got its what I call the Where's the Koala campaign with methamphetamine, which is every time something goes disastrous in the polls, they go, methamphetamine. And it's like walking your kid through the forest. You know, you take your kids up to the Flinders Ranges and they won't walk any further. Not going any further, Dad. No, I'm stopping here. I can't stand it. I hate walking. Look, there's a koala. And governments do that with drugs. Heroin, methamphetamine, cannabis, you name it, alcohol. They might do. They don't do it with gambling because they get too much money from gambling, as Nick pointed out. But it's really important to recognise that those kinds of distractions can be problematic for the evidence that we're looking for. But nearly everybody who uses methamphetamine uses alcohol problematically, and they use cannabis problematically, and they use diverted diverted prescription drugs as well. Very few people. And what we may be seeing is a whole lot of behaviours that go along with internet use that parallel that drug and alcohol use. And when it comes to online gambling, I think one of the real risks of online gambling in the home is that 80% of all alcohol consumed in Australia is consumed off premises. So 80% of the alcohol that we drink in the home. And when we drink alcohol, it's a depressant. It reduces our inhibition. So we are far more likely to act out than we are if we haven't had alcohol. So alcohol depresses, it reduces our inhibition. There's a really simple test of this. If you go out and have one drink, you're far more likely to have 3 drinks. If you have 3 drinks, you're far more likely to have 6 drinks. And if you have 6 drinks, you're far more likely not to get home that night. And so it's an escalating scale, okay? So what do we learn from that? We learn that if you go out and you have one drink and you can stop at one drink, then you won't have another drink. And that's called diversion. Think about diversion. If you go home and you think, oh, God, I need a glass of wine. Michael's talk gave me a real headache. And so you go home and you think, I'm going to have a glass of wine. If you can put off having that glass of wine for half an hour, there's really good research that will show you will not have that glass of wine. If your kids come home from school and the first thing they do is go on the computer and play Crossy Roads, if you can delay that for half an hour, there may be fairly good evidence to say that that half an hour of delay is protective enough to shift them into some other behaviour. It doesn't matter what the other behaviour is. You know, you might, oh, I'm not going to have a glass of wine, but I'll eat all of that chocolate that I got. So gambling and alcohol and other drugs are both linked to mental health issues and both linked back into reduced self and emotional control. And there are now strong links between behavioural and substance use disorders. And this is kind of where I'm going to finish because a lot of the other stuff has been said. But I actually think that what we're seeing with young people, and this is the killer statistic that I came across the other day. I've been running workshops and trained to run workshops on cannabis. And the biggest problem for young people like 10 or 15 years ago was that there was a constantly increasing rate of cannabis use amongst young people. And people were really worried. John Howard gave $7 million a year to a national centre to prevent the uptake of cannabis, NICPIC. So I went off and I did the NICPIC training. And when I was doing the NICPIC training, I had to go back and update some of the slides that I'd been given because I don't like out-of-date slides. And one of the things that I noticed was that the age at which young people are taking up cannabis has been going up. For the last 5 or 7 years, maybe 10 years, there has been a statistically significant increase in the rate at which young people are starting to take up cannabis use. So it's gone from about 16 to 16.8. Doesn't sound a lot, but that means that there are a lot of 15-year-olds who are not using cannabis compared to 10 years ago. The rate of smoking uptake is rising as well. There's a huge number of kids who are not smoking. And the rate of drinking alcohol amongst young kids has dropped phenomenally. Now, when I started 20 years ago or 25 years ago in drug and alcohol, if I'd put up that comorbidity slide, 90% of the Australian population drank 20, 25 years ago. Now it's 80%. What we've seen amongst young children is that there is a massive cohort of young children who have never started drinking. And up into their 20s, they haven't started drinking. Now, this is fantastic news for us as drug and alcohol people because we can go, woohoo, we're working. But I want to ask you a question, and I'll close on this question. If drinking does things to my dopamine and my serotonin and the other neurotransmitters, and basically what it does is it strengthens some neural pathways in my brain that make me want to go back and have that reward again and again and again, even if it starts to harm me. And if cannabis does that, and if methamphetamine does that, and I can get the same effect from a $1.99 app, which I buy from Apple, on my phone, I might have once got that effect by going down the pub and playing the pokies. But now I can sit in my room and I can have the dopaminic surge affect my mesolimbic system, whatever you want to call it, from the age of 3 or 4, as soon as I get my hands on my parents' phone. What's that doing? What's the conditioning? I may never take up heroin. I may never become a meth addict. But is my internet gaming and my internet usage any better for me? Is it any more protective, etc., than if I had been, like me, a 12-year-old smoking, a 14-year-old with a bottle of whiskey under the bed, that kind of thing? It's fairly horrifying. I wouldn't know a 14-year-old now that had a bottle of whiskey under the bed. There might be some, but it was pretty common in my day. All of the 14-year-olds I know now have a gaming machine at the end of their bed or a computer at the end of their bed. That's what they want. So are we actually seeing a significant shift? Can we look at that data over the longer term and see that there's a significant shift? And if there is a significant shift, what are the harms that are involved in this? We know that there's significant economic harm to people who gamble and lose money. We know that there's an enormous amount of money being spent on computer games and on the software that goes with them and on the computers, etc. But what are the long-term harms? And we're so early on in the piece that we don't know that kind of stuff yet. I will close, though, by saying, and this is recent innovations in video game research and theory, which is King and Del Fabro, and it's the last paragraph of the report, so you've had other people reference this research as well today. The majority of individuals have experienced little or no disruption to their psychosocial functioning from playing video games. As compared to other addictive behaviours and other known causes of psychological distress, involvement with video games appears to pose relatively few risks to health and psychological well-being. A lack of research on the positive aspects of video game playing leaves it open to the possibility that the potential harm resulting from them may be outweighed by the positive aspects of the activity. So we don't know, but I'm very interested. And it's our job to go out and find evidence and inform our communities about it. Thank you.